Good afternoon, everybody. I imagine everybody's got kind of a crazy side to them, right? What? No? I'm all alone? Alright, that's cool, I can handle that. You know, the whole idea of being crazy is a state of mind, right? No pun intended, but, you know, our psychiatric and our psychological system of, you know, trying to integrate people into this normal society. And I'll smoke a joint to make the example. Back in the 30s, they told us that marijuana would make you insane. It would make you crazy. It would make you do crazy things. I don't even need to go into the reefer madness details, but we know today that's not true. We know today that's not true at all. In fact, if anything, it may induce pre-existing conditions in someone who is already prone to have them. But it cannot be directly correlated to making a person insane. You know, it's a ludicrous thought. Looks like it's raining a little bit. I want to make sure my camera doesn't get wet. Here we go. So, here we come into the 21st century here. And people smoke pot on a regular basis everywhere. It's no longer, even though it's still socially awkward to do so, in a lot of places, for the most part, people have no real reservations about showing that they smoke marijuana. And even generations between my mom's and my generation, you know, her generation, you know, they're a little more reserved than ours, and my generation's a little more even reserved. Even though I was a proponent of legalizing cannabis and everything when I was younger, and I always wore pot shirts and tie-dyes, you still find yourself hiding a little bit. Am I going to get in trouble? You know? But you don't, because it's legal here. So I'm using cannabis as this example. Perceptions change, things change about what it means to even be crazy, what it means to be mentally unstable. When I was younger, there was this, and in fact this came up the other day, I saw this on another article where somebody had said, if you take acid more than 7 times, you're legally insane. And, you know, of course when you're 14 or 15 you hear that, you think, oh really? You know, what does that mean? You don't even think it through. Of course, legally insane doesn't mean anything. Legally sane, I guess, you could be legally sane, and you could be considered insane, but there's no legally insane definition, and nor is there any amount of times you take LSD that makes you insane. LSD is a good example because it's one that really does put people in an almost psychotic state into the outside. It may have, if a person sees a person who's really tripping hard on LSD, it may think, oh my god, I would never do that, look at that person, they're just out of their mind, they're crazy. And when you're in a state like that, you may think you'd never come down. You might think you'll never come back. In fact, I've been so high sometimes I started wondering, even though I know I've done this 100 times or more, God, I know I'm going to come down, I'm still like, but what if, you know, what if I finally snapped? Because the reality you're seeing isn't like being drunk or just confused. It's a very real feeling that you could actually shift your perceptions and think a certain other way for a long period of time. And that's what sets psychedelics apart. Cannabis, on the other hand, can be almost psychotic in its own right. So, you know, I guess this video would be more than being about just what is being insane. It's like, do drugs make a person insane? Are there any drugs that can lead a person to a state of insanity just by the drug itself, and not the person's, you know, pre-existing condition or predisposition to have a condition? I consider myself a pretty intelligent person, or rather, fairly balanced in my thinking, not too far one direction or another. You know, not trying to stroke my own ego or anything. I'm just saying that when I compare myself to many people that I see in my daily life, I feel like I'm pretty well adjusted to dealing with society in the social and vocal aspects. On the other hand, I don't do well with the whole doing what I'm told. I'm not good with authority, but that's not what we're talking about. I feel mentally stable. like I can tackle anything I want, I can do whatever I want. And feeling that way is a great thing. It's a freedom, you know. But at the same time, it's also almost a curse, because at times you feel like you're obligated to remain a certain degree of mental stability, like you're analyzing your behavior on a day-to-day basis. And I guess I'm not really a big drug user, so I can't say, look at me, I use drugs and I'm intelligent or anything. I'm just, I actually have smoked pot every day pretty much for the last 25 years, minus a couple of years I quit for being on probation for a year and a half. And I did quit another time for 5 or 6 months, so I have quit for a period of time, but found that cannabis works for me, and it puts me in a more balanced state. And so I'm thinking, and this is another discussion I had with somebody earlier about how drugs in their own sense aren't, you know, they can be used as a tool or a weapon to destroy your own mind. If you find the right amount of something that works for you, you know, then it can help to repair or supplement what we need. We have dopamine, we have, you know, our endogenous morphine, which are endorphins, which are sometimes lacking. We have serotonin, which is sometimes lacking. Sometimes you know, there's too much uptake or not enough uptake. You become either serotonin depleted or overwhelmed, and it can cause serotonin syndrome. All types of different things happen from medications and just from being human. But then there's the 5-HT2A receptors, which is what psychedelics work on, which is basically mimicking serotonin in a way. They're like these keys that fit in a lock, and each one turns it slightly differently, different feeling. And they're trying to find that one that just triggers emotion without the psychedelic high, or just psychedelics without the emotional high. And what this is doing is allowing us to play with our receptors. And this is where people have found that a mega dose does this and that to a person, makes them feel, you know, like they've had a great revelation. But the microdosing helps certain other people who need to just deal with an ongoing issue of depression. And whether you have acute or chronic depression or anxiety can be helped by taking different substances. And so there's this fine line when we take drugs as to what considers a person insane. What considers a person insane? Smoking a joint, you know. Talk too long. See, I should always smoke a joint when I do a video, so I'm forced to pause, because I end up just talking. I roll my joints too tight, too big. Well, it's not that big, but the amount of cannabis I smoke has varied over the years, and sometimes I've smoked a lot more than I do now, and I actually have gotten to the point where I just, you know, smoke 4 or 5 bowls a day probably, but, you know, just take a couple tokes at a time. And psychedelics maybe a couple times a year to help balance that out. And so I've been experimenting with a little bit of microdosing, but wondering, how is that going to mess with my psyche? Is this going to mess with my ability to process these drugs when I really want to use them for mystical experiences? So I started out with the mushroom microdosing, and then I stopped. And then I wanted to start doing LSD microdosing. And I started out with just 1 drop. It was too much. So I thought, well, if I took a drop in a glass of water, somebody said they did that, just took a sip each day. And that might work, as long as I keep it put away. But I decided I don't need the microdosing, because I'm not a depressed person. I'm not an anxious person anymore. I've learned to mentally conquer those. So it's like I'm moving beyond the day-to-day issues. It's the long-term things I'm working on, you know, fixing my mind on the future, on who I want to be and what I want to be, and finding out what the world wants from me and what I want from the world, you know. And I want those things to be mutual, not mutually exclusive. I want to, I guess, how do I put it without sounding too mystical? Because those who know me know I'm a rational person, but I'm also a mystical person. And it makes it difficult when people, you know, if I say one thing, a person will say, oh, you're just a, you know, you believe in some kind of a god. And then if I say another thing, a person would say, oh, you're just an atheist. And I get accused of being one way or the other. it's irrelevant, my personal views. It's just, I believe in a higher force and energy that's aware of me, and that only recognizes me if I'm aware of it. In a way, it's a manifested reality, a manifested, not a God, but because a God implies a one conscious being, but rather a multitude of gods within gods, wheels within wheels, cycles of larger and larger awarenesses that we're just part of. Just like a smaller organ within our body is aware on its own accord, but also aware of the whole. And each cell within that organ is aware of its place, and within the organ, and within the body. And we're just one step between atoms to cells, to organs, to bodies, to local communities, to continents, to the entire world, to the universe, so on and so forth. Fractals. Dendritic patterns where everything just branches out or branches down, you know, and you get into so many different philosophies and like, what does all this mean? You know, how small can things get? How big can things get? And you totally get blown out of proportion and forget. You just got to remember, you know, it's easy to get carried away with the complexity of things, but helping to observe these patterns, seeing these patterns, helps us to live better, I think. And the reason I got into that is because psychedelics, you know, although considered to be something that makes people crazy for so long, have helped me to see more patterns, and not just delusional patterns, because I've been able to distinguish between the delusions. To an extent, it's kind of a playful game that your mind plays with you, and the universe plays with you. My thought is it's irrelevant whether these thoughts that you have under psychedelic influence are some primal remnant that's left over in your mind, or if it's something that you actually tap into the universe to gain. It doesn't really matter. Maybe it's a harmonic frequency within your DNA. It could be a million things. It doesn't matter. We could play with all the different what ifs, but what happens is, what we know is over thousands of years, people who take psychedelics have profound mystical experiences that change their lives in a positive way, and very rarely in a negative way. In fact, when you hear of somebody have a bad trip, especially like on mushrooms, it's like they say, most likely a bad trip usually is like somebody hiding under the blankets for a couple hours, rather than jumping in front of a bus. You know, the rare stories are always blown out of proportion, and the experiences a person can have are so amazing. For me personally, it's been a life changer. We got a hold of a lot of LSD when I was 15, and then I started going to dead shows, and I'd get sheets for like $50, so I just had a lot of acid around all the time. We took it whenever we could. We never abused it to the point of taking it every day. We were smart. We took it every weekend usually, or maybe every other weekend, whenever we could. But the experiences that I had, I didn't realize until the mysticism creeped up, and I'd hear all these stories about how it makes you crazy, it makes you crazy. And I started to say, you know, society's crazy. These psychedelics have taught me that society is crazy. And then I learned, you know, and then people would say, well, cannabis makes you think too, you know, and it's like they tried to suppress it to keep us from thinking, and then for a while I believed that. Now I realized that it was just, you know, it's always profit driven. It was about, you know, the hemp industry, the oil industry, all these different, you know, companies wanting to own a plant, and it just, the side effect was making the bud, everything illegal, and now it's being legalized again, and so these drugs are coming back. And my thought that is within a couple more years, you know, at least a decade or so, psychedelics will be finally legalized for prescription use. MDMA and psilocybin are both under research in separate places in Cali. One's at Johns Hopkins, actually. They're doing, the university is doing a study on mushrooms and finding that really psilocin is what you're after. But the psilocin, the way it affects body and the mind, is just, it's an amazing thing, an amazing experience. I wouldn't recommend all psychedelics for all people, but psilocybin is one that I think everyone needs to try. But with exceptions, of course. I won't even get into that. Talk to your doctor first. I gotta go. I'm still limited to my 15 minutes of fame, so peace. I love y'all, and